Welcome to the end of the world. And I mean that literally. Not as a slogan people throw around online, not as a dramatic metaphor, but as a quiet realization that millions of people have started feeling over the last few years. Something about the world we grew up believing in no longer feels stable. For most of modern history, people were told a very simple story. The world was progressing. Institutions were trustworthy. Experts knew what they were doing. And while the system might not be perfect, it was fundamentally stable. Most people accepted that story without questioning it. They built their lives around it. They trusted the authorities and they trusted the systems. They trusted the institutions that claimed to organize society. But in the last few years, something strange has started happening. One by one, the pillars people trusted started to crack. People watched a global pandemic shut down entire countries almost overnight. They watched governments impose rules that would have sounded impossible only months earlier. They watched wars erupt in regions that had spent decades promising stability. They watched artificial intelligence suddenly begin writing code, creating art, and replacing jobs people thought were secure. They watched institutions that once claimed moral authority become exposed in scandals that had been hidden for decades. And slowly something shifted in the collective psychology of society. People began questioning everything. They questioned the news, they questioned governments, they questioned corporations, they questioned religion. They even started to wake up to the realization that satanic, cannibalistic pedophiles who drink the blood of children have been running the world. And when a society reaches the T level of distrust, something very strange begins to happen. Ideas that once sounded impossible suddenly start sounding believable. Narratives that once lived on the fringe begin appearing in everyday conversations. People begin entertaining possibilities they would have dismissed immediately only 10 years earlier, not because everyone suddenly lost their minds, but because when trust collapses, the imagination fills the vacuum. When people no longer believe the official explanations they were given, they start searching for new ones. And whether those explanations are correct or not is almost beside the point. The point is that the psychological atmosphere has changed. People feel like the world they were promised is dissolving. And when that happens, people start searching for something deeper. Something that feels real, something that exists beyond the systems that are clearly failing. Which is why, in moments like this, an ancient name always begins resurfacing again. Jesus. Even people who grew up skeptical of religion often find themselves returning to his words, because there is something about the figure of Jesus that refuses to disappear. Across centuries, across cultures, across civilizations, his name keeps returning to the center of the conversation. But there is something strange about the way most people talk about him. Because the Jesus most people think they know is not the Jesus you actually encounter when you read what he said. The version of Jesus that many people grew up hearing about is remarkably safe. He's gentle, encouraging, comforting. He helps people live better lives. He encourages kindness. He comforts the suffering. He tells people they are loved and forgiven. And again, none of those things are necessarily wrong. But if you actually read the words attributed to him, that safe image begins to fall apart very quickly. Because the man described in the Gospels was not safe. He confronted religious leaders publicly. He accused them of hypocrisy. He called them blind guides. He called them whitewashed tombs. Beautiful on the outside, but full of decay on the inside. He told them they cleaned the outside of the cup while the inside remained corrupt. He flipped tables in the temple and drove merchants out with a whip. He told people their social identities meant nothing. He told people their reputations meant nothing. He told people their religious performance meant nothing. And perhaps most disturbingly of all, he told people that unless they were willing to lose their lives, they would never truly find them. That is not the language of a comfortable spiritual teacher. That is the language of someone dismantling an entire way of living, which raises a very uncomfortable possibility. What if the real reason Jesus was executed had less to do with politics and more to do with the threat he posed to the identities people were protecting? Because the religious authorities of his time had built an entire system around moral authority. They believed they were the guardians of truth. They believed they were the interpreters of God's will. They believed they were righteous. And then Jesus walked directly into that system and told them they were blind. He told them their religion had become performance. He told them they were obsessed with appearances while ignoring the corruption inside themselves. And people who build their identity around righteousness rarely respond calmly when that identity is threatened. Eventually, those religious leaders did something remarkable. They worked with the political power of the Roman Empire to eliminate him. Two groups that normally hated each other suddenly found common cause, because both groups recognized the same danger. A person who teaches people to stop fearing authority is a threat to authority, but the story does not end with the execution, because the message continued spreading, and over time something even stranger happened. The revolutionary figure who had challenged religious authority eventually became the center of a religious institution. The man who criticized religious hypocrisy became the symbolic foundation of organized religion. And institutions operate very differently than revolutionaries. Institutions prioritize stability, structure, order, predictability, which means the most disruptive parts of a message often get softened or ignored or reinterpreted. Because if people actually followed the deeper implications of what Jesus was saying, many of the systems claiming to represent him would become unnecessary. And this is where the real tension appears. Because the real threat in Jesus' message was never political power. It wasn't Rome. It wasn't governments. The real threat was something much closer to home. It was the ego, the identity people construct around themselves. The version of the self that depends on status, reputation, control, belonging. Jesus constantly targeted that structure over and over again, and he told people the kingdom of God was not something you join through an institution, as it was something discovered through transformation. He told people to become like children, not powerful, not impressive, not socially dominant. Children, which means something very uncomfortable. Before something new can be born, the identity you built has to die. And that is where the resistance begins. Because the ego does not want to die, it wants to survive. It wants to adapt. It wants to keep its identity while appearing spiritual. Which is why throughout history, religion often becomes a way to preserve the ego instead of dissolving it. You can still have status. You can still have hierarchy. You can still have authority. But now it is wrapped in spiritual language. And suddenly, the most radical teacher in human history becomes safe enough to place inside a building. Safe enough to schedule once a week. Safe enough that almost no one has to confront the terrifying implications of what he actually said. Because if the real Jesus appeared inside the modern world today, he would not just challenge governments. He would not just challenge corporations. He would challenge the identities people are desperately trying to protect. He would challenge the idea that belonging to the right group makes you righteous. He would challenge the belief that moral performance makes you spiritually alive. He would challenge the assumption that religious affiliation automatically brings someone closer to truth. And he would say the same thing he said 2,000 years ago. If you want to find life, you must be willing to lose the one you built. Which might explain something strange. Why so many people claim to follow Jesus. But almost no one seems comfortable with what he actually taught, because the real message was never about improving the self. It was about the end of the self. And that idea is just as disruptive today as it was 2,000 years ago, maybe even more. Because what people are feeling right now in the world, the chaos, the distrust, the sense that something is ending, may not actually be the end of the world. It might be the end of the identities we built inside it. And once you start seeing that difference, another question appears. If belief alone is not enough, then what actually leads someone to truth? That is what we will explore next. Welcome to the end of the world. Take a breath. You are exactly where you are supposed to be.